Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. For reasons unclear to me, the last 3 or 4 weeks, everything I've said has started that way. So let's see. Right. So the geometry we learned in high school was about triangles, circles, squares, cubes, things like that. These tell us almost nothing about the shapes of nature. If you take this, I'm going to point to this coastline, but you should be looking at that one. If you look at that coastline and think of something fairly mundane, like trying to measure the length of the coastline, even that turns out to be a difficult problem, maybe even impossible. If you measure it at a scale of kilometers, you'd get a certain length. If you measure it at a scale of meters instead, you'd pick up more wiggles and wobbles in the coastline. The length would be longer. You measure it at a scale of centimeters, even greater length. In fact, there's no well-defined length for a coastline. The length depends on the scale at which you measure it. There's a funny consequence of this that's been familiar for a long time. In some old encyclopedias, in the article on Spain, you will see that the border between Spain and Portugal is 620 miles long. In the same encyclopedia, the article on Portugal says the border between Spain and Portugal is 760 miles long. It's the same border. So this is a cute puzzle. I'll let you think about it a bit. The problem, of course, is that if you zoom in on a coastline, the roughness appears to be about the same. It looks more or less the same over a lot of scales. We see something similar. There we go. Something similar. These are sutures in a deer skull. You see it's got wiggles and wiggles and wiggles on lots of different levels. The lungs are a really good example. This is a cast of a dog's lung that was made by Dr. Robert Henry. Human lungs are similar. We have, on average, about 23 levels of branching in the lungs. Our lungs have a volume of 5 or 6 liters and a surface area of about 130 square meters. We want a large surface area to be able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. If you look at a picture of a lung and you wonder how in the world the area was measured, that was a technique developed by Dr. Ewald Weibel at the University of Bern. It's very clever, smart guy. So the problem of folding that area into that volume is more or less the equivalent of taking an envelope and folding it up to fit inside a thimble. But evolution discovered a way to do this by branching and branching and branching again. Every little bit of the lung looks a lot like the whole lung. We see something similar with mountain ranges. Oops. We lost our picture. There we go. We see I'm sure it wasn't something I did. Well, maybe. What do I know? We see something similar with mountain ranges. Long mountains, large mountains are surrounded by smaller mountains, are surrounded by still smaller. Floret of cauliflower looks a lot like a head of cauliflower. Holes in bread are surrounded by smaller holes, are surrounded by still smaller holes. Benoit Mandelbrot developed terminology for this phenomenon. He called it self-similarity, and shapes that are self-similar he called fractals. Self-similarity, the word similar in this is used in the same sense as similar triangles, that is, the same shape but a different size. And so our example to begin with is this shape. It's called the Sierpinski gasket. Sierpinski was the mathematician who studied its geometric properties about 100 years ago. Artists have known this for much longer. This is a decorative motif at least 800 years ago, maybe longer. So what we see here is I've broken the gasket up into 3 different colors, so you can see it's made up of 3 pieces that are each about half the size, half the width and height of the original. But if you focus on one of them, say the red one, for example, you see that it also is made up of 3 pieces, and each of those is made up of 3 still smaller pieces, and on and on and on. A natural consequence of self-similarity is what we could call scale ambiguity. You can't tell if you're looking at the whole shape from up close or a tiny bit of it. No, sorry, you can't tell if you're looking at the whole shape from far away or a tiny bit of it from up close. We're familiar with this from geology texts. If you see a picture of a cliff face or a stream bed, there's always a hammer or lens cap in there to give you a sense of scale. This is one of Benoit's favorite slides. thing you thought was a lens cap is actually a garbage bag stretched over a hula hoop with the word Olympus written on in masking tape. Recognizing self-similarity is half of the issue, but if we want to understand why fractals are useful in the world, we need to know how to grow them. And so for that, we use iteration. Repeat the same process again and again and again. The gasket will be our guide once more. Now, this is a math talk, so there are going to be some numbers on the screen occasionally. These are they. The numbers R and S tell us how much we shrink horizontally and vertically each piece. Theta inferior rotations, which we aren't using in this example, we'll use in the next. E and F tell us how much we move left and right. So if I take the gasket and shrink it by a half, and then take another copy of the gasket, shrink it by a half, and move it over a half, and take another copy, shrink it a half, and move it up a half, I get the gasket right back. Those three rules, shrink by half and move over, shrink by half and move up, will take the gasket and give you exactly the gasket right back, and the gasket is the only shape for which that's true. If you apply those three rules to anything else, the shape changes. For example, this is a sketch of one of my cats. I'm going to apply the gasket rules to the cat. I think I'm going to apply, maybe cat's shy. There we go. Okay. So shrink and move over, shrink and move up. We get three little cats instead of one big cat. Of course, it's not the same picture. But suppose we do it again. Shrink and move over, shrink and move up, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. No matter what you start with, if you apply the gasket rules again and again and again and again, you get the gasket. If you think of this as a static shape, just a picture on the screen, it's really quite complicated. It's got infinitely many triangles in it. The equations of those triangles are not at all straightforward. But if you think of it as growth rules, it's extremely simple. Just those 18 numbers in our table uniquely design the gasket. That's all we need to describe the gasket. Now, we don't have to build just gaskets. We can make all sorts of things. For example, this picture was first made about 25 years ago by one of my students. It's one of the early examples of a natural-looking fractal. I thought it looked pretty good, very tree-like. I made the mistake of showing it to a botanist I know who says, well, it doesn't exhibit heliotropy. The branches don't bend upward toward the sun. He evidently thought we had some more work to do. I like the tree, so this is what we're using. The tree is easy to split into pieces. Each of the four branches are just slightly smaller versions of the tree. Two of them we rotate left, two of them rotate right, lift them up. Trunk is a little harder. Take the whole tree, shrink it a lot horizontally and half vertically. You get the top half of the trunk. Do the same thing, flip it upside down, you get the bottom half of the trunk. So if I apply the tree rules to the tree, I get the tree back. If I apply the tree rules to another one of my cats, and my wife and I have 7 cats, but don't worry, we're not going to turn all of them into fractals. So here we go. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Tree rules take everything to the tree. Fractals are really good at finding simple descriptions of a lot of complicated shapes. Not everything for sure, but a lot of them. They're also good, obviously, for biological models, but not just the lungs, the circulatory and nervous systems, the liver, cross-sections of bones. Weibel thinks our DNA encodes not the shape of our organs, but growing instructions, more or less like the tables that we've written down here. Evolution discovers fractals. But we see them in other places as well. The distribution of galaxies, the structure of the web itself. Dali's painting Visage of War, the music of Warinen or Ligeti, even some literature. Amelia Uri and I are writing a series of stories, structurally fractal, we hope. They're about cats. If you want a practical application, Chip Cohen has been building fractal antennas for a long time. The reason the antennas work so well is because the different length scales in the fractal allow them to be sensitive simultaneously to a wide range of frequencies. So he's adapted this technology to build a fractal microwave invisibility cloak. This is it. It's concentric cylinders. The target, the thing you want to make invisible, goes inside. The cylinders are shy. There we go. Cylinders are covered with fractal antenna patterns. And in the experiment I'm going to describe, there's a microwave emitter over here and a receiver over there, and you just shoot the microwaves at the receiver to begin with. You adjust the gauge on the receiver so the signal that comes unimpeded, you set to the 0 of the scale, and then anything in between, any target that scatters microwaves back, that's what makes you visible in radar, will be seen by the receiver as a drop in the signal received. The target is Peter. This is Peter about to crawl inside the microwave invisibility cloak. This is Peter's image without the cloak. You see he absorbs a whole lot of microwaves. He would appear not absorbs, he scatters a whole lot of microwaves. He would appear nice and bright on a radar scope. This is Peter cloaked. Between 750 and 1200 megahertz, he's microwave invisible. Okay. Most of our manufacture is based on the geometry that you learned in high school. The few times fractals have been used in design, this is one of the examples, but also others, higher efficiency capacitors, fuel cells, chemical mixers, we find remarkable new advances. This is a new field. I think the most interesting things are yet to come, although this invisibility cloak is really pretty cool. I want to finish up with some things I learned from Mandelbrot. That's him hiding behind the model there. A visitor some years ago said to Benoit, I've read your papers in physics, in math, in finance, in hydrology, in linguistics. What are you? What do you call yourself? Without hesitation, Benoit said, I'm a storyteller. And he did love to tell stories. But eventually, I realized that there was another way to interpret that. A fractal description of an object is a story about how it grows. The shape of a snowflake is a story about the pressure, temperature, and humidity it encountered on its path through the cloud. A coastline is a story about rocks and tides and waves. A mountain range is a story about plate tectonics and erosion. Fractals remind us that science has a narrative component that we too often ignore. Fractals remind us that stories are important. And the last thing I want to tell you is a story about Benoit. This will involve my mentioning a belief I have, which I'm not asserting that anyone should adopt this view. Alone in the dark hours before dawn, each of us must embrace our mortality in our own ways. This is just my interpretation of it. Benoit died of pancreatic cancer about 6 weeks after he was diagnosed. After he found out about the diagnosis, all of our conversations, except for the very last one, were about work. The projects begun but unfinished, how they'd be completed and by whom. And that's how our very last conversation started out as well. But after about 20 minutes, I could tell he was getting tired. His voice was weakening. He paused for a moment and he said, Mike, what happens when we die? This is the only time he called me Mike. It was always Michael. But this one time, Mike, what happens when we die? Big question. Some people take some comfort in the fact that we don't know where we were before we were born. Yes, says Benoit, I've heard that. But you and I do know what happens. Yes, I think we do. Neural connections break down. Consciousness dissolves, and we're gone. So nothing persists. Of the consciousness, no. But the work you've done, Benoit, oh my goodness, that will persist. You've taught tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people a new way to understand nature. In fact, you've given geometry a beautiful new language for telling stories about nature. Hundreds and hundreds of years after you and I are gone, people will remember you, will remember your work. He sobbed, said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, good night." Died a few days later. Ultimately, the thing that mattered most to Benoit was that the work he had done had helped people. That was the thing that made the most difference to him. So at this point in your life, if you are thinking about what you can do with your life, I urge you, I beg you, whatever you do, make sure some part of it helps people. This too is scalable. We can help people in small ways or in large. It's a mistake to think that this is a penance, that it's some noxious task you have to do because you owe it to your community. No. This should be the greatest possible joy. I've taught for over 40 years, over 4,000 students. Some of them I have helped to recognize the importance of curiosity about the natural world. Some of them I've helped to recognize that our responsibility to help one another is not a burden but a precious gift. If we can find ways to help one another, this is the important thing to do. Find the thing you love doing most. Find some aspect of that that involves helping people and throw yourselves into it. Then, at the end of your life, when you look back, you can say, yeah, that was not bad. Then you'll be satisfied with what you've done, as I'm satisfied with what I've done. Thank you very much.